This show is sponsored by Lightyear, a new straightforward platform offering a stocks and shares ISA with no account, subscription or custody fees. Lightyear's stocks and shares ISA will be 10 times cheaper than the average market provider over 10 years based on research conducted by Capital Economics. And its cash ISA offers easy access to the Bank of England base rate. Both accounts are flexible so you can withdraw and reinvest without affecting your annual limit. Capital is at risk and ISA rules apply. Other fees like foreign exchange fees may apply. Lightyear UK Limited is authorised and regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority.
Hello and welcome to episode 495 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm good, Andy. Quite excited for this week's show actually, because we're going to do something a little bit different. But as ever, it's been a very busy week at Money to the Masses. Do make sure you go and look at our social channels. So I'm talking about TikTok, Instagram, Threads, Twitter. We're doing things on all of the channels now. And of course, we've still got our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/money to the masses. But the reason I want you to go and look, particularly at Instagram and TikTok, we've had a lot of viral content this week. So we put out clips from the previous episode of the podcast. They make very good shorts on TikTok. And the energy piece we did last week has got a lot of interaction. I mean, just at the point I'm looking at it now, it's only been up for about 48 hours and it's had about 55,000 views and loads of comments and a lot of debate actually about energy prices. So do go and join in the conversation over there. It does help us if you go over and look at the content, like it and interact. So also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel as well.
So moving on to what we've got coming up on the podcast this week, we're going to try something a little bit different because our usual format, as you know, is we cover three main topics and we get into quite a lot of detail on those. Well, this week we're going to dial it back a little bit and do more of a sort of a discussion really on a couple of money decisions that we've made in the past.
Yeah, so what I wanted to do is to give people some insight into what actually our background as well, Andy. So people are going to learn a little bit about you and I, but what I wanted to do is demonstrate the fact that no matter how good you think you are with money, that we all make good decisions, we all make bad decisions. I can hear Lola barking in the background there, Andy. We all make lucky decisions and we also have bad luck. And our journey through life is a combination of all of those things. And what I want people to realise is that we've done the same thing. So as I'm the expert on the show, it doesn't mean that I've never made a bad money decision. A few weeks ago, we talked about hindsight bias. And there are a lot of people out there, when you read the comments on our YouTube channel and on our Instagram posts and TikTok posts, people who sit there and talk about their past and decisions they've made as if they knew more than anyone else and everybody else was a little bit silly for not making the same decision. The reality is people do have a lot of hindsight bias when it comes to looking at their past and the decisions they made. So what I want to do is just demonstrate the human side of what it's like to make good, bad decisions. And ultimately, the important thing is to learn from them. So the one thing that I've always been good at is learning from the bad decisions I've made and also the good ones along the way, but also acknowledging the luck that I've had, good and bad. Now, a lot of people who are successful don't acknowledge the large part that luck plays in the outcome and where they ultimately end up. Oddly, the people at the other end of the scale who perhaps end up somewhere where they don't want to be financially will often bemoan the bad luck they have. So what we want to do is just talk about some of the things that we've done in our life, good, bad, lucky and unlucky, and just to demonstrate to people that we are all human. So I'm going to kick off with one of my bad decisions in life, and this centers around debt. And you've got to realize that the world is full of pitfalls and traps for you to help you make those bad decisions. I always remember walking through a shopping centre when I was probably about 19, 20 maybe. And there was one of these stands and I'll name the company actually. It was American Express, and they had one of these stands that had somebody on there giving you a credit card, trying to encourage you to sign up for credit. And of course I did. It is normally an incentive along the way in most of these things. And I signed up for a credit card and then started to use that credit card. The problem was that at that time, I actually had a job after university that paid me quite well. And I could more than afford the things that I wanted. In fact, I lived at home. I paid a relatively small amount of housekeep to my parents at the time. Yet what I did is I seemed to assign in my head that the money in my bank account was mine, but so also was the money on the credit card. So I used to live on the credit card. I even drew money out of a cash point, can you believe, on my credit card to go on a night out. And rather than clear that credit card at the end of the month, I just used to let the debt accrue and would have the money that I had earned and I'd spend that as well. So I was just basically living beyond my means. And what ended up happening, which I'll come to later, is my circumstances changed. And it was actually through another bad decision of mine. And it ended up having a debt that I couldn't repay because I was no longer earning the money that I had once earned. So I ended up with quite a large amount of debt on credit cards that took me the best part of my 20s to repay. And that was a harsh lesson. And like I said, there were traps along the way trying to get you into debt as a young person. But once I had that debt, I didn't learn how to use it responsibly, and it set me back. But one of the luckiest things I have to point out was that I always maintained direct debits to pay the minimum monthly amount on the debt. So that was possibly a sensible decision on my part. I mean, it was actually more than likely probably a bit of a lucky one. So I didn't actually wreck my credit report when it came to the point that I was older and wanted to start doing things like taking out credit more responsibly, perhaps buy a house. So I hadn't wrecked my credit report. So I'm going to put that down as something of a lucky decision, because a lot of people would sit there and say, well, I was incredibly sensible with money and what I did to own a house by the time I was 29. That was the point when I bought my first house. And I could say that, but the reality was I'd probably have to admit there was a little bit of luck in the fact that I hadn't damaged my credit report at that point in my life.
Yeah, I did a very similar thing. I signed up for a credit card. This isn't my worst, by the way. This is just another bad decision that I made. And you might find a theme coming in the podcast later on. But I also did a thing. I signed up for a Barclays credit card in a shopping mall, almost exactly the same circumstances as you, Damien, but it was leading up to a wedding. And while we had some wedding savings and we had some very generous gifts from family members, we were a little bit short. And ultimately, that credit card ended up bridging some of that shortfall that we had. And of course, one thing led to another. We got married. I took my eyes off the ball. We then went on honeymoon. And because I didn't set up a direct debit, I did miss a couple of payments along the way on that one. And so I did put a bit of a black mark on my credit rating as a result of that. And so it was a kind of a domino effect of bad decisions.
Yeah, and so like you said there, Andy, that then is with you for an extended period of time on your credit report. For example, people who end up defaulting on debts and maybe have CCJs, they end up being on there for 6 years. So I think it's one of those things that a lot of people might not realise when they're young. They see it as free money, but ultimately it could hamper a future decision you want to make. And so I mentioned in my piece, okay, some people are going to be marvelling at some of the mistakes that I made. And this is probably the biggest mistake I made. And it was closely linked clearly with a period of my life where I was being very frivolous. And what happened, in reality, I left university and I started to train to be what is known as an actuary. And I don't want to cause offence to anybody out there who is an actuary, but if people don't know, a lot of people don't know what they actually do, but they make accountants seem really interesting. They do a job that is very well paid. My best friend who listens to I went there. One of my best friends who actually I studied to be an actuary. And obviously, as you know, I didn't stay the course. I passed some of the exams and then decided it wasn't for me. He continues to do it. And he even says that. So you can have a pop at me for an actuary, but they will be from their very nice house and very expensive cars. Because let's be honest, the average actuary earns over, well, £100,000 plus a year. They're the people who design products for insurance companies, that sort of thing. So it's very technical mathematically. Anyway, I was in a world where I was starting to do that job and I was doing it for a major bank. And really, I kind of was in this something called a pension review. And it was really a panic by the banks who were going to get into trouble. Think of it like the PPI scandal. They've done something naughty in the past and they are now under pressure to redress people. And they are needing people to calculate the amount of redress for the people who had been encouraged to transfer their final salary pensions into personal pensions. And I was one of the people who mathematically, obviously, was gifted enough to be able to calculate that. I had a maths degree. So anyway, I ended up at this job. And because it was a job that was an element of panic and deadlines, and they were going to get fined lots and lots of money, millions of pounds, in fact, if they didn't hit deadlines in terms of those repayments, they paid the people who did the jobs very well. And I had a job from university that I didn't realise I was look, I just come out into the world and I thought this is how the world worked. And then I realised very quickly that it didn't, because I was at this job and I negotiated a redundancy from the job because I just didn't want to do it anymore. And I moved to London and started to rent a flat with my brother. And I had a convertible car at that point. Gets worse, doesn't it? I know. A new convertible car that I'd already got a couple of years previously, and went and lived in London. Actually, I lived in Wimbledon. And so it wasn't even the cheapest place to go and live. And I didn't have a job. And I'm not going to obviously say the amounts of money I was given, but I basically lived 6 months without any job, quite happily living the high life. Long story short, I squandered all of that money. And then I was probably at a bit of a low then. And there are some bad decisions. That was a very bad one. And I had to therefore find a job, because what happened, I thought I was going to find a job very easily. And I went out into the market with that probably youthful enthusiasm, maybe arrogance, because it had been slightly easy for me when I actually got into employment. I hit a market that was very bad and it was very hard to get a job. And that's why I ended up, I wasn't just sitting there for 6 months doing nothing. I actually did try and get a job along the way, but I found it very hard. And in the end, I fell into financial services, which is where I met Andy. So there's a positive to this story. I ended up meeting Andy at the company I went to work for. So it's definitely a positive.
It's nice that you're adding this as a caveat. Let's not forget that the title of this section is Worst Financial Decisions I Ever Made. So I'm still in the worst category, just as a bit of a bonus.
Well, that was obviously 20-something years ago, Andy, and we are still friends. Funny enough, I actually met my wife during that period. So she went on to be my wife at the point that I didn't have a job and I was probably just enjoying myself. And so what a catch I must have been. So she always reminds me of that she met me when I was technically unemployed. So, she obviously didn't want me for money or anything like that. So I ended up going into the financial services, and that's where I then started to study. I had to start from the bottom again, and I realised my mistake. I learned from it, and I realised I had to go and study exams and build my career back up, because I had experience in a particular type of skill that was no longer going to be needed within a year or two, because the pension review changed, it stopped. And so that was the beginning. I learned from that, and it was a slow progress for me in my career, where I then studied and became financially astute and an expert in it, and I ended up working in the financial advice arena. And I didn't earn the same amount of money as I did at the age of 21 until a decade later. So I was probably around about 30 before I earned the money that I did in my first ever job at university. So that was one of my worst decisions, that I ended up not pursuing the career that I could have done. And I ended up moving and doing something really reckless and wasting a lot of money, and fortunately didn't get myself into hideous amounts of debt or wreck my credit report during that period. But then what it does highlight is something I want people to realise, that often it's only with hindsight that you realise this, that some of the luck that you have, the good luck, does often come fairly close to some of the bad luck. And also some of the worst decisions and best decisions often go hand in hand. So that was my worst decision, but the opportunity arose for me to then enter the financial service in a slightly different way. And it was the beginning of a journey that 10 years later gave birth to Money to the Masses. And I'll come on to that a little bit later. So there you go, Andy. I don't think there'll be many people that will throw away a career quite spectacularly as I did at the age of 21.
I'll be honest, you're going to win this category, because your worst decision is far worse than any of my decisions. I just seem to have made lots more bad decisions, but not quite as catastrophic as yours. I'll give you a couple of examples of bad decisions that I've made. Now, financially, I've made quite a lot of bad decisions in my past. I mean, aside from deciding to have children, we'll park that one, and that's a discussion for another day. Because let's be honest, you're never going to recoup that kind of investment that you make. I would say selling a flat was my worst decision. Back in 2015, actually, let's go further back than that, just very briefly. 2007, 2008, we saw the start of what was the financial crisis. Obviously, we didn't know that was going to happen when you and I, Damien, were both purchasing our houses, and I was purchasing a flat at a very similar time. We essentially bought at the top of the market following a huge financial crash. Not too much of a problem if you're buying a house that will maybe serve you for at least 10 or 15 years. we knew that the flat we were buying, we were probably only going to live in for a year or two because we were already on that process. We were married. We were deciding to have children, 1-bedroom flat. We knew we'd have to move. And so ultimately, it kind of falls into an unlucky category as well because we were unlucky. We didn't know that a financial crisis was about to happen. But ultimately, we were forced into a position where we had to move on from that flat once we had children. So fast forward, make the story very, very quick. We decided that we needed to rent in a different area in a house, and we let the flat out. We let the flat out to a friend of ours. We didn't necessarily get the market rate because we were kind of doing it quite quickly, and we were forced to do it pretty quickly. And so we were doing them a favour, they were doing us a favour, and I was effectively doing it at a bit of a loss. I'm not the best landlord, I realised, and I found the whole situation very, very stressful. Property prices weren't going up like we thought they might do. Obviously, we had that huge crash and then they plateaued. If we were going to sell, we would have lost quite a lot of money. So we waited and waited and waited. And eventually, 7, 8 years later, the property prices came up to a point where they came back to ultimately what we paid for the property. And I decided that was it. I'd had enough. I was going to cash out. As soon as the property was worth roughly what we paid for it, maybe a little bit more, cover the solicitor fees, that's it. I'm done. And of course, we were renting at the time. And so essentially, I sold our flat at a slight loss because of the solicitor fees. But all of our deposit had been piled into that original property. Plus, because it was our first property that we ever bought, we did have our first-time buyer benefits like the stamp duty. So all of that was invested in that property. Fast forward 7 years and the property doubled in price. And again, we talked about hindsight earlier, didn't we? Looking back in hindsight, it was the worst decision financially that I've ever made. I mean, for my mental health at the time, I would still argue that it was a decision I made that was based on reason. But there we are, probably the worst decision I ever made.
I have to say, there are a couple of points there, Andy. You said you were the worst landlord. You were not. You were like the best landlord ever. You were letting someone live in a flat at a below market rate. There are people sitting there thinking, Andy, we wish we had more landlords like you out there. The other thing I have to say, though, is that does sound more catastrophic than mine. We're not competing how bad our decisions are, Andy, but that was pretty bad. It set you back for longer. I do think, though, that you raise a really good point, is what I want people to take away, is that you have to remember when you make decisions, and there's something I've learned throughout my financial life, particularly when I'm investing, is to write down the reasons why I make decisions and the information that I have at the time. So I avoid that hindsight bias. And going back to your point, Andy, there are more things in any decision that you make that go beyond the financial. You didn't know the prices were going to go up. We didn't at that point. In the financial crisis, we didn't know what was going to happen to property prices. And also, like you said, the type of property you had didn't recover as quickly as others did. And there were places outside of London where people will focus about average property prices that influence the average across the UK. They will say that properties recovered by a certain point, but there'll be areas in the UK where property prices didn't recover for years and years after the financial crisis. So it's just to emphasise the point, really, we didn't know where things were going to go. And your mental health part and the stress is key to a lot of things, I think, when it comes to decisions. Would you have made a different decision? With the benefit of hindsight, you may have done, but you don't have that benefit. It's funny, though, you talk about that period. That is actually my unlucky list. So if there's anybody out there, you get wind of me moving house or buying a house, then you want to run for the hills because there's going to be a financial crisis or something at that point. So when I bought my first house, I don't know why I'm laughing, but when I bought my first house, it was almost the eve of the financial crisis. So I bought a property that, therefore, within months, I mean, I never had it valued, but based upon the numbers out there and what was being published, the value of it presumably dropped. And as a first-time buyer back then, in those days, you could get mortgages. I mean, you still get 95% mortgages and 90% mortgages now, but back then, you could get 100% mortgages even. Now, I didn't do that because I was never going to do it. That was a good decision on my part. I deliberately didn't want to because I was nervous about the idea of negative equity and impacting my future decisions. So that goes into my good decision category. But obviously, as you know, the financial crisis, and then I got locked into a mortgage rate for 2 years at the point when rates just crashed probably about 3 or 4 months later. And I was paying around about 5.25% interest rate on my mortgage, and rates obviously tumbled. Now, I don't have the security of the house. Now, you could argue that the financial crisis could have made the likelihood of me getting a mortgage, say 6 months later than I did, may have made that perhaps less likely. So I don't know whether I'd been able to get the house anyway. So I was in the house, but the positive was that I actually took out a repayment mortgage. Now, if you go back to that period, a lot of people would still get interest-only mortgages because it was a period in time where people were buying houses and basically flipping them 2 years later. So people just getting on the property market, they were buying houses with their friends because the prices were just going up and up and up. So if you bought a house a year later, people would just go, oh, we'll move out, sell it, and they made money for their deposit. And for some people, that did work. They had a deposit for a future house. But obviously, this came to an end because there was something bubbling in the background as we had the financial crisis. So it meant for me that the good decision was I took out a repayment mortgage. And that repayment mortgage did keep my options open. So even, say, 6 months later, I could have moved if I'd wanted to because I was paying down my property value. I did take a 100% mortgage. Maybe I'm being a bit optimistic saying 6 months, but certainly within a couple of years, because I was owed less on my mortgage than the value of my property. So it kept my options open. And there was lots of people I knew that had interest-only mortgages. So that has a good decision in there, baked in, but also an unlucky one because I fixed just at the point the market crashed. But then I'm going to just lead straight into a lucky decision, therefore, that came out of that. So I had a mortgage with Nationwide back then, and Nationwide had probably an infamous mortgage product that they probably loathed. Now, one of the conditions of the mortgage was that the rate that they could charge, this is beyond the fixed rate period, couldn't be more than 1% above the Bank of England base rate. Well, when my fixed period ended, that meant my mortgage rate plummeted because they were unable to charge me more than 1% above the base rate. Well, that saw my mortgage repayment absolutely tumble. It was still more than other people I knew had interest-only mortgages, but I was still paying down the mortgage. I was okay with that. But it was fortunate because it was around about that time that we were then planning to have a family and my first daughter was born. So that did benefit us because we did save a lot so she could ultimately have a break from work when she actually gave birth to our first daughter. But that did sort of ease things. That did grease the wheels when it came to our finances. So there was a lot of luck in that as well. So the reason I bring that up as well is I see a lot of people online who sit there and go, oh, you need to work harder. These people who Gen Zs and millennials need to work harder. I worked hard. You should see when interest rates were at 12%. We did it. And the reality is that they aren't admitting the element of luck that occurred in their finances. So I could sit there when I'm 65 and say to my kids and grandkids, do you know what? Your mum gave up work for a period of time. We struggled on one wage and just bought a house and the financial crisis happened, blah, blah, blah. But the reality was there was an element of luck for us as well that helped us a bit later after the financial crisis. It wasn't great at the beginning, but it helped us. And that is the same as people who talk about interest rates that were sky high back in the day. The reality was that the ratio of their earnings and the mortgage payments they had each month was much lower than it is today. So they also lived in an era where they were able to buy their council houses. So my mum and dad bought their council house when I was small. And that was a turning point for our family because it meant that we were able to start owning things, and that then had repercussions in a positive way for our future. Now, my dad is different to a lot of people. He will talk about how much luck plays into his finances and the way life worked out. I think he underplays how much of it is actually down to good decisions as well. But that being humble is important because the reason it is if you don't be humble about what happened to you and your decision making and how you end up where you are and the role that luck plays, then the advice you give to people who are younger than you is flawed because you will say, which I often hear, you just need to work harder. The reality is if being successful was just a function of working harder, then the people in society who work the hardest, let's say somebody has a manual job, somebody maybe who's emptying bins or doing something that is very manual and very hard work, they would be the wealthiest in society. So that isn't true that it's just down to hard work. There's an element of luck that happens in all of our finances. You just need to acknowledge it because if you don't, it also means you're likely to make worse financial decisions going forward because you have that bias that you think that you are amazing at doing things and you can predict the future and you previously made an epic decision because you knew the financial crisis was coming when you didn't. And therefore, you're likely to make an impaired decision going forward.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to actually look at luck and acknowledge and appreciate that. I'm happy to admit and that I was very lucky a few years ago when I decided to write a book on my travels. I was on the train, I had nothing better to do in my life. I like to write, so I started to become a bit creative. It was all a bit crazy at home. We'd just started to have a family and it was quite stressful. And so I released some of that energy rather than sort of posting on social media my thoughts. I just started to write them down. And then I realised after a few months that it might make a comical diary. People may have heard this story before on the podcast, but ultimately I started in around September time. And by the time it got to near Christmas, I had about 3 months worth of stuff that I'd written that I'd edited up and thought, do you know what? It was the boom in self-publishing, and I had a few friends of friends that had had some success in uploading stuff onto sites like Amazon and self-publishing little novellas and things. So I thought, well, why not? It's coming up to Christmas, book sales, who knows? And here comes the luck element. I published my book. It had a few people download it, family and friends, very kindly put a few comments and things online. But then I decided a few days before Christmas to put the book on a free sale, if you like. You get a certain amount of days that you can market your book for free and send it out to people. And then it was just an element of good luck and timing, because what it did is it launched itself to the top of the free charts. So you have 2 charts on Amazon. You have the free charts and then you have the paid charts. It kind of went very, very close to the top of the overall free charts. It was at the top of the comedy list. And when it ticked back to a paid book, that was ultimately Christmas Day, Boxing Day. And it was the year when the Amazon Kindle went absolutely crazy for sales. And my book just happened to be near the top of the charts and the free charts. People downloaded it and word of mouth and reviews. And ultimately, I sold something like 40,000 copies of my book. What it did mean financially for us was that my wife could give up work and we could focus on having a family. And it just really made things really easy for us. It gave us options, which was fantastic.
And the thing is there, Andy, you mentioned again luck. And there is a slice of luck in a lot of things, but then it was also that element where you can make your own luck. You tried it and you learned from it, and then you helped me get the book that I wrote on money, so the 30-day money plan, to the top of the business charts, because you helped me with some of the marketing element and the things that you'd learned. So I think it's interesting you say that about luck, because it also leads on to my best decision, which was obviously Money to the Masses. So I know people will probably be familiar with the story. For those who are new that aren't, that back in 2010, just after my daughter was born, I met my twin brother Justin for a coffee in Leadenhall Market, which is in the city of London near where I worked. And I was a bit disillusioned with the fact I'd just come back from paternity leave and just basically making rich people rich. And I enjoyed the job, but I wanted more from life. And so in the end, long story short, I ended up launching a blog that was just a hobby in the background, a bit like you and your writing, Andy. That was me giving away the financial knowledge that I had. And the short version of the story, it grew. And after 4 years, I then quit my job and started working on it full time. And then it's obviously grown through a lot of hard work to where we are 15 years since that initial coffee. But that was a decision that was born out of sort of perhaps timing in terms of where the world was at that point, the fact that technology was there to enable us to do it in terms of, you know, things like WordPress, and blogging was a thing that was really popular at that point. And that wasn't necessarily the best financial decision at that point, because I actually, again, left a very good career actually at that point. Well, actually, this seems to be a recurring theme, that I end up getting to a point in a career that's going to go somewhere. And then I decide that it's not for me for whatever reason, and then I leave and go somewhere else.
Can I just say, as an employee in this business, can I just say not to make any rash decisions? Talk to me before you jump ship again.
Right. This goes back to, I think, how people's brains work. I do jump around quite a lot. People listen to this podcast will know I do, but I get very focused on something, and I think that's what enabled me to be creative and end up creating Money to the Masses, to go a different way, not necessarily become down the route having to get clients to become an advisor, giving advice, or just working sort of in another area of investment or whatever it might be. I decided to do a kind of a third way that didn't exist, and end up going and writing for the greater good and the wider public. So anyway, that was ultimately a great decision for me for personally. And in the end, it's obviously had its benefits financially as well. But that is one of those things that has an element of luck in it, because I did actually make the decision. I could have had that coffee and not gone home that night and started a blog, started writing, or might not have actually continued with it. So there is that element of luck, and the world was in the right place at the right time for something like that to occur. And it was a commitment. It isn't just luck, but it does play its part. And equally, I have to say, I think there is that point where people have to realise when they are born makes a massive impact as well. So how old you are when certain things occur. So there'll be people out there. We had this conversation, okay, in the office, and we said to people, can you give us some of your own good decisions, bad decisions, lucky decisions and unlucky? And the one that really had me almost rolling on the floor was one of the, I'm not going to name them, but one of the people who work for us, who was obviously much younger than Andy and I, said, yeah, the unluckiest thing was that it was when I was born. And basically pointing out the fact that the what they would call the boomers have obviously a lot of assets, and the people who are obviously much younger are in a very different place. And I do think you have to acknowledge the difference. I know there'll be people out there that aren't happy about that, but you have to acknowledge the fact that the world is very different for different people, and there are different challenges that you didn't have. It wasn't just down to hard work that you ended up where you are if you are a boomer. I'm not knocking people who have made good of what they've had in life, but you have to acknowledge that people born in different places at different times have very different life experiences. And I don't really believe that you would always end up in the same place given different starts. So I think that's something to obviously acknowledge.
Yeah, you make a really good point. We've talked about house prices and how it's very different now in terms of young people trying to get onto the property ladder and the percentage of people's income that's required in order to just try and save up a deposit and get on that property ladder, but also things like student debt and student loans. I mean, the whole landscape of that has changed, and people now deciding to go to university are not in the same position that students were 20, 30, 40 years ago. So it is a very different landscape for people of today.
Yeah, and I think you have to acknowledge one thing that I've talked about in the podcast before, which is privilege. That doesn't mean basically being somebody from high society. It can be having an advantage over somebody else. It could be just something as basic as coming from a home where both parents remain married, or somebody who has parents that have reliable jobs and don't lose their job during your childhood, or something like that. Even being able to be given some help at the beginning of your journey onto the property ladder, or maybe when it comes to repaying some debt or student debt, stuff like that has a massive impact on your future. It was interesting because I mentioned asking some of the team their good and bad decisions, and one or two said, oh, they couldn't think of any. But then when they actually thought back, they actually did come up with some bad decisions. Everyone's made bad decisions along the way, and some good and lucky and unlucky ones. One that was interesting was somebody invested in a meme coin. So that was one that didn't work out. And the good thing is they learned from it. As I said, making mistakes is one thing, but learning from them is way more important. But Andy, let's get to some of your best decisions. What are they?
Yeah, funny. I also asked some friends of mine before coming onto the podcast about best decisions, and one of my friends actually said marrying my wife. So I thought that was an interesting take on things and quite honest of him. The best decision, when I was thinking about this, I was initially thinking about property, maybe savings, but a lot of that led into sort of luck, and we talked about my unlucky past with properties. But my best financial decision really was re-engaging with my workplace pension around about 5 or 6 years ago, which actually coincided with coming to work with Money to the Masses. So what had happened is when I was younger and I had no children and I was still living at home with my parents, I went straight into my workplace pension on the advice of my parents and the people at work who were advising me and telling me, yeah, you absolutely need to do this. Put in my 5%, the company will match it. And I built up an okay pot. And then what happened is we had less money, we got married, we had a property, we had children, and suddenly the disposable income wasn't there anymore. And so the first thing that gave way was my pension. And at the time, I didn't really think anything of it. I thought, well, that's free money that I can have back in my pocket. But of course, what I ended up losing out on was the company putting in their bit as well, and also the tax relief, the generous tax relief that you get on top of that as well. So I probably went through a period of 10 years or so where I didn't engage at all with a workplace pension. And when I got back into working with Money to the Masses and I started writing more for a living and understanding the whole process, I was like, what have I done over the past 10 years? I've wrecked it. So I went straight back in and I really haven't looked back. I won't go into numbers, but I've doubled my pension pot in 5 years, which, having not engaged for 10 years, I'm pretty proud of that.
Yeah, and I think you should be, because one of the things you pointed out, Andy, you reminded me that was one of my worst as well. I regret not engaging with pensions. It's ironic that there's a guy who worked in pensions for his first job and left university and worked for a bank. I did the same thing, that you just got to the point where you disengaged from it. I mean, let's be honest, I've already told you how my career went in a slightly unusual route. But then the places I worked, I actually didn't value the benefits that I was being given at that age. So a lot of jobs I went to, as I progressed, they would not give benefits, they would increase the wage. And I focused too much on the take-home wage and not enough on any benefits. And as a result, there weren't any benefits in a lot of the places that I worked, including pension contributions. Now, this was pre-auto-enrollment. So auto-enrollment has helped a lot of people in that regard, because there is now going to have to be pension contributions for most employers if you meet the criteria. But that is a regret that I didn't actually engage with pensions earlier. And so it was a mistake and a bad decision. And then now I am, like a lot of people who are my age, also having to play really catch up more than they should have done if they'd been investing throughout their lifetime. And of course, it is a bit different when you're somebody who's building a business at the same time, because that can also play into it as well and get in the way. But I'm totally with you, Andy. I think that was one for me. I wish I'd engaged with it sooner. That was one of probably my worst decisions as well.
Yeah, and so I suppose what we've demonstrated there, Damien, is a kind of a good and a bad side of how we've engaged with pensions, but it is really important to engage with pensions. So I think we've demonstrated in recent podcasts. And I suppose one of the other things I noted down here when I was thinking about one of the best decisions I made, it was doing marriage allowance, because it was super easy. Ultimately, my wife wasn't working for a number of years, and I wasn't aware that you could move some of your wife's or your husband's, depending on who the main worker is, their tax allowance, their tax-free allowance, over to the other partner. And so what I ultimately did is I moved some of my wife's unused tax allowance over to myself, and it meant that I could earn more money tax-free. And it's easy to do. We'll put a link in the show notes to an article where we explain it a little better.
So just to wrap this up then, Andy, I'll give a few more of the good ones I've made. Also, one or two from the team as well. Somebody mentioned Lifetime ISA. They actually managed to get £17,000 worth of government bonus via their Lifetime ISA. But the downside of it, I suppose you could say, was bad luck, that the limits that are inherent in Lifetime ISAs on the value of the property you can buy meant that they could not buy the property or properties in London where they wanted to. So they ended up having to buy property further out of London, which is obviously not what they ideally wanted, but they found a house that they like. So that is a good decision, they said, which was followed up by perhaps an unlucky decision by using a Lifetime ISA. Somebody else mentioned they were unlucky that they were born when they were and they didn't have a final salary pension, which tickled me. I have to say some of the best decisions I've made have normally been related to purchasing property. So my house, my latest purchase, I got ahead of the curve very early in terms of what I would need in terms of evidence for my mortgage, my earnings, all of those things, a good year or more ahead by talking to the mortgage advisor that I use. And I also saved very aggressively for the stamp duty and the moving fees and legal fees, so it didn't impact the property I could buy. So it gave me more of a wiggle room. A lot of people go and try and buy a property and then realise there's all those additional expenses, which therefore ultimately limit their ability to buy that house, and they probably can't buy the house they need. For me to be able to go and buy the next house up, because I lived in my first house for 14 years, I kind of needed to therefore buy the next house. Given the movement in property prices, I needed to make sure I had greater flexibility. So I saved aggressively. And I also worked out that because of my age, that I wouldn't be able to just keep taking out mortgages and extending the term. I couldn't do that. So I was going to have to, obviously, and I wanted to clear that debt. So I was taking a bigger mortgage, but I was obviously going to have to be paying it back over a more limited period of time. So I knew all of those moving parts ahead of time. I planned for it. Again, like the financial crisis, I believe a few months later, I probably wouldn't have been able to buy the house that I now live in. And that was because we saw mortgage rates go up aggressively after that period. And that therefore would have impacted affordability. So it was all about timing. We saw inflation was going up. You could sit there and say, with the benefit of hindsight, that I knew this was happening and it was a brilliant decision. I was hedging my bets. I could see, for me to be able to try and move the other problems in terms of my age and what I earned and what I wanted to buy, it was a little bit of luck that I got in before rates went up. So that was one bit of luck. But the other bit of bad luck was I didn't fix for 5 years. And again, the reason I didn't do that was because I wanted the flexibility. I didn't know if I moved to this place where I would like it and I'd be stuck there for 5 years. And for me, emotionally, that it's quite a big thing, that when I live somewhere that I have to like it. I find it incredibly stressful if I lived somewhere and I was unhappy. So for me, that trade-off meant that I didn't fix for 5 years, but then the decision was made. And so what I did after that, and I did a whole podcast on it, if you go back, where I talked about building a buffer when it came to remortgaging. So when rates did go up, when I came to remortgage after the 2 years, the pain was much less because I built another cash buffer. I seem to have this very aggressive, almost sprint style of saving ahead of problems that I see coming. And then I'll save aggressively. And if the problem doesn't materialize, then I have a pot of money that I can do something with. But I saved aggressively ahead of a remortgage so I could then subsidize my future higher mortgage payments with lump sums out of the pot of money that I had in a savings account. So again, it's this good decision, lucky decision, unlucky decision in terms of all the rates, and then another good decision. They all kind of come very close together. And what you have to do is learn from them, and you have to be flexible. So that's always why I promote flexibility in my finances over other things. And so the message for everybody is really don't compare your journey in life when it comes to finances with somebody else's, because you can't compare your beginning, middle, or end with anybody else's, because you're at different stages and you might have been born at different times, all of these things, and you don't know what life's going to throw at you. So I don't beat yourselves up. Learn from the decisions you make. And really, we are all human. And as Andy mentioned earlier in the podcast, he said about, he made me laugh when he talked about, I just made more bad decisions. Now, the thing is, you've got to try and limit them. But as you get better at making decisions, you will make less of them and hopefully less catastrophic ones, and make more better decisions along the way. Because if you don't admit the truth about the decisions and the information you had, and you rewrite history, you're more likely, like I mentioned earlier, to make worse decisions. And ultimately, I don't think I would change many of the decisions I've ever made if I was given the same information, the same time when I made them. I probably would end up doing the same good, bad, and indifferent ones.
Well, Damien, I think that's very honest of you and noble of you to say that you wouldn't change any decisions. I've got one or two that I definitely would change. I'll give you a little bonus one, if you like, because I didn't mention this one, but it did happen to me. I may have mentioned it in the podcast before. Probably my worst financial decision was when I was in my early 20s. I hadn't passed my driving test at this point. In fact, I wasn't even close to passing it because I hadn't had any lessons. And I was on a business work trip and I was away. I was up in Leeds. I lived in Watford at the time. And I was chatting to a really nice guy, and he happened to mention that he had a car that was for sale. And I had it in my mind that I wanted to learn to drive, and it looked a very nice car, and he showed me around it. And I made the decision there and then to buy that car. Which I thought was a fantastic decision because I thought it was a good deal. And then it dawned on me that I had a car that was living 200 miles from me, and I didn't know how to drive. I hadn't passed my test. So ultimately, what it meant was I had to send my brother up to Leeds. So I had to pay him to go and do that, cover his petrol money on the way back as well. And he picked up the car for me, and it sat on the drive. It depreciated. Ultimately, I think I ended up giving it to my brother. Or the long story is, I bought a car 200 miles away when I hadn't even passed my driving test. By the way, I didn't pass my driving test for another 9 years until after that.
Andy is that is a brilliant story. I tell you what, actually, again, bonus ones, best and worst. Some of the best and worst decisions I made. Well, like I said, I had that brand new convertible car when I was very young, and I didn't have any other bills. And it was my pride and joy. And looking back on it now, it's probably a bit cringe, really. But that car I sold to a family member, and that went south in terms of like the way it panned out. And the other one was, best decision really was I got rid of car finance. And I've done a podcast on this about one of the best ways to grow your wealth is to not have car finance. And so most people will be paying probably £200, £300, £400 a month to finance a brand new car. And actually, when I moved house, I cleared the car finance agreement that I had with money that I'd saved up aggressively. And therefore, it meant that I was so much better off a month. And that obviously had a massive impact. Actually, I paid off the car before I moved house, which therefore was a positive for my affordability assessment when I came to the mortgage. So I aggressively saved, cleared it, and then it was a positive for my affordability assessment. And also I didn't take on a new car. So that was another positive. And we're nearly done that. Actually, I just thought of another final one that was unlucky, but it wasn't crippling or anything. It was a bad decision, but like didn't cost us lots of money. But I've also got Crohn's disease, and in my 20s, my wife and I, now wife, we were going to go to Thailand for a holiday. We were so excited about going on to Thailand for a couple of weeks. She'd already travelled through there before I'd met her and gone around Asia, and she wanted to say, you've got to go. So we were going to, but unfortunately I got sick with my Crohn's disease and ended up having to have operations and stuff beforehand and couldn't go on the trip. We didn't have travel insurance. And so we ended up having to pretty much appeal to the good nature of the airline to try and get back some of the money for flights. And we didn't get all of our money back. I didn't think we were going to get any of it, to be quite frank. That just emphasised the importance of having travel insurance for somebody like me. And in the end, I think we got about 60% of the flight fare back. So it wasn't a complete disaster, but it was definitely a lesson, and especially if you've got pre-existing medical conditions.
Damien, this podcast has got to end soon. I'll give you one quick extra bonus. We could do a whole separate podcast on my bad money decisions, but you mentioned flights there, Damien, and I've got to mention one of my worst money decisions. And really, it was all about planning. You must make sure when you're booking flights and planning holidays, do check everything. Do the insurance route as well, as Damien suggested. I decided in my ultimate wisdom that I was going to propose to my wife, and I was booked flights to New York. And my wife was a teacher at the time. And so I needed to make sure that I got the dates right. So I went online and I checked the term dates for my wife and when she was going back to work. And it was over the Christmas and New Year period. We met on New Year's Eve. I thought, well, how lovely and how romantic to get engaged on New Year's Eve in Times Square in New York. Booked the trip, several £1,000s. The flights in themselves were a couple of thousand. This was many years ago as well. These were good flights. But they were non-refundable and non-transferable, obviously. And I quickly realised that I was looking at the term dates for the previous academic year, and I didn't get any money back for them. We had to rebook the flights for a day earlier. So not only did we pay twice for the flight, I paid twice for the flights. I also had to then cut the trip short by a day. And here's the rub, and here's the really embarrassing part. I spent so much having to rebuy all of these bits and pieces, and I was living on credit at the time. A lot of this was credit card purchases. I didn't have enough money left to buy the engagement ring on Fifth Avenue in New York. So that went on the wife's credit card.
I'll tell you what, Andy, this just goes to prove that we are all human, but also why I'm not a romantic like you. Andy is a romantic, and obviously I wouldn't ever get into such a difficulty like that because I wouldn't probably have the foresight to do that. And luckily, my wife doesn't listen to the podcast. So I think that is it, Andy. We are done. I mean, hopefully people enjoyed that. What I really would love is for people to share their own stories of good, bad, and the lucky and unlucky decisions in their lives if they are up to it. And just even if you don't want to, do try and look back at your life and the decisions you've made and the lessons that you've learned and the ones you should have learned and perhaps you haven't. And if you haven't got something in each of those four columns, good, bad, lucky and unlucky, then I'd question whether you're being honest with yourself and you aren't actually got a bit of bias in your view of life and you're rewriting history slightly. If that's the case, then do be careful because you could end up making a worse decision as a result in the future. As ever, please do review the podcast on any app that you use. Also, do follow us on all the social channels that I mentioned at the start of the show. Particularly make sure you go and follow us on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, like everything we ever do on YouTube. There's a lot of stuff we're putting out now that will never make it to the podcast because it's a different medium and it works better on some of our social channels. So do go there, join the Facebook group. And I think, Andy, all that's left for us to say is until next time.
Until next time.